right, folks, let's do this. My name is David Parsons. You are listening to Nostalgia Trap. This is a podcast where we take the wide view, the longer view on American history, politics, pop culture, the end of the world. We try to avoid the hot take economy as much as possible. If you like that sort of thing, there's a whole lot more on our Patreon page. You can access all of that at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. We appreciate the support. We've got tons of new stuff this summer, including new podcast called Campus Trap with me and Ryan Boyd talking about the nightmare of working in higher education during the 21st century, and Gender Trap with me and Yasmin Nair talking about gender, feminism, queer politics, and this insane moment with all of that. We didn't anticipate that Roe versus Wade would be overturned and we'd be sort of taking the wide view on this moment in feminism, but that's what we're doing. So if you want to check all of that out, patreon.com/nostalgiatrap, and we have a bunch more bonus material on there coming throughout the summer. We look forward to seeing you there. And I hope you enjoy this conversation. This is with Alicia Puglionesi. She is a historian and writer. We've had her on the show before talking about her amazing first book, which is called Common Phantoms, which was a history of psychic science in America. Her latest book is called In Whose Ruins: Power, Possession, and the Landscapes of American Empire. This book is awesome, and I think Alicia is like one of the most interesting and compelling historians working out there because she's willing to talk about stuff like ghosts and hauntings and get a little metaphysical. This latest book, In Whose Ruins, is about stories and about storytelling, about the stories that are used to justify land theft, genocide, and the endless extraction of natural resources for profit. In short, this is the story of the stories, how the stories that create the ideological superstructure that hold the American project together, where those stories come from. A lot of them are total horse shit created by capitalists, and Alicia gets into the details of all these stories. I thought this was a really fun conversation. I hope you enjoy it, and like I said, if you're into what we do here at Nostalgia Trap, check out our Patreon, patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. All right, let's do this. Here is my conversation with the one and only Alicia Puglionesi. Thank you so much for joining me. I appreciate it. How are you?
Doing well. Thanks so much for doing this.
Sure. I mean, we had a really great time last time you were here, which you just reminded me was right at the beginning of the pandemic. You came on to talk about your book, Common Phantoms: An American History of Psychic Science. And we had a lot of great feedback from that conversation. I think what your work does for people that aren't aware of what you're doing in your work, I think it's present in your newest book too, is combining a lot of the methodologies of the history of science with the methodologies of the humanities together. I mean, I guess the history of science is the humanities as well. But there's sort of the through line between science and the humanities is very strong in your work. And I feel like your latest book is something that does this in an even more pronounced way than your first one. So I want to say the name of it before we even get started. Your newest book is called In Whose Ruins: Power, Possession, and the Landscapes of American Empire. So thanks again for being here.
Yeah, thank you again. I'm glad to have another conversation about another book also coming out during the pandemic.
Weirdly enough, I feel like the pandemic will be something that historians will be talking about in terms of haunting America in the future. And it seems like you're a little concerned with haunting. It feels like is that right for me to say?
Yes, that is definitely right.
How is it? What do you conceive of as haunting? What do you mean by that?
I think it's obviously a very flexible term that people understand differently in different contexts. And for that reason, I think it's very powerful and useful because it's just in the broadest sense, it's a way of thinking about memory and what it means to remember. And then there's that kind of famous Eve Tuck and C. Ree essay that I quote in the book because it formulates it so well, that it's remembering and reminding that is persistent and, perhaps unwanted, something that people don't want to hear. And I've definitely been thinking about it in the context of the pandemic, and sort of putting my historian of medicine hat back on and just like really, it's been a reminder of how little we want to remember and how little we want to see suffering, disability, and death. And it really, even like, I wrote this book during the Trump administration, basically. And so a lot of my thinking during that period is inflected into the book. And, we can talk more about this, but a lot has changed even, since 2020 in terms of like my outlook and what I would see as like possible or worth hoping for.
Yeah. It's pretty grim. I wonder. I'd love to hear more about that idea, kind of like writing this during the Trump administration, and then things shifting or not shifting, and how that changes your perspective on all these things. But just to talk a little bit about what your book is actually about, In Whose Ruins. I mean, there's a lot to it, and it's to me partly about stories and partly about the sort of natural environment and the way that resources have been exploited in America and how stories connect to that. And I want to just read the section. One exercise I often do in classes with undergrads is, give them a piece of writing and have them try to locate the thesis statement. Where is it? What's this author actually saying? And I don't know if this is your thesis statement. But I wanted to read it because it's a piece of your introduction from this book, In Whose Ruins, that I think it intrigued me, and it felt like this is central to what you're saying. So here's a little bit of In Whose Ruins. You say, quote, "At each of these sites, new origin stories evolved in tandem with the needs of the moment, always concealing or justifying casualties. Manifest destiny, the idea that certain deserving white Americans were chosen by God to rule from sea to sea, was not a single policy or campaign. Some U.S. leaders opposed territorial expansion, while others schemed to seize the entire North American continent. A belief with many permutations can still converge on the same result. It's completely obvious that this logic served resource extraction and the murder of indigenous people. Yet it becomes easy to dismiss a simple Oregon Trail version of Manifest Destiny as a thing for history books, which ended with the closing of the Western frontier, another bad, antiquated prejudice. In fact, this belief never stopped mutating. It's just one name for a state of anxious consumption. American culture continues to produce new stories that justify the violence of the past and fantasize its recurrence in an apocalyptic future." I thought that was so smart and scary. And is that the thesis of the book? Is that one of the main claims you're making here?
Definitely, yeah. That's definitely at the core of it, this sort of use of the past as a resource and stories as a resource, and the way that is like tightly interlocked with actual resource extraction and violence and expansion. Yeah, and it's interesting because I've kind of like thrown up my hands as to like the book having an argument and been like, I'm not trying to make an argument. It's not an academic book. And it's not a new story. Like it's not a new story. It's a repetition of well-known stories, just sort of looking at them in a deep and sustained way. And that's kind of where I landed. And I think to the extent that there's any novelty, it is in that that conceptualization of the past as a resource. And I found very helpful confirmation of that formulation in the work of like historians of archaeology.
It's funny. I like that idea of like overturning just even the sort of simple story that's told, the Oregon Trail version of Manifest Destiny. I feel like even the left and liberals like to sort of tell that story a lot. Well, they like to kind of, and this is maybe a post-60s turn, but I feel like there's sort of a smug, well, the Native American genocide happened, and that was that, and sort of like Manifest Destiny. Telling that story is just kind of like a way to make a claim about the badness of the United States. When what you're doing is sort of getting into the details of that story as not being a settled story when it was happening, and one that was even distorted afterwards. In other words, the story serve a purpose. And maybe we can get into a little bit of what those stories are, because you chose for your book four different like not only sites but kind of pieces of American power. I feel like, and like power not just in an abstract sense but a literal sense when you're talking about things like oil and nuclear energy and things like that. But the first story you tell in your book is about these the mound culture, right? And something that I had no idea about, which is that there were, like, I think a lot of people know that there were sort of Native American tribes building these mounds that are ancient, and they're kind of throughout the North American continent, but they're located in certain places. But the idea that there were white people who sort of like made up stories about that these were actually not indigenous people that made these. Can you tell me a little bit about that story? Because it seems like it's so critical. It's like literally people saying, no, these weren't Native American mounds that were built. These are white people built this. It's almost like an ancient aliens kind of thing.
It is. There's a direct through line. And a few years ago, I went with my friend Jonna McCone to the Alien Convention, sponsored by the History Channel, which was in Baltimore. And I was expecting just like fun times talking about UFOs. Unbeknownst to me, the ancient aliens people were there, and we saw them do their spiel, and I was tearing my hair out because the evidence that they presented on their slides for this being like a conspiracy that the Smithsonian is covering up and the archaeologists are covering up, the evidence was these 19th century newspaper articles.
Oh my God. Wow.
Yeah. It's just like evidence 101. This is they were not in fact telling the truth, and there's a reason for what they were writing, and we can discover that reason. So yeah, there's just a direct through line, recycling the same sort of canon of these alternative histories. And I think that I was first clued into it in an undergraduate history of anthropology course, and didn't know what to make. It was a novelty to me. I was like, how did this almost a meme of 19th century antiquarians come about, and how is it perpetuated? And so it's been a longstanding interest. And when I started looking at these alternate histories in terms of resources and thinking about land, that's how it locked in with the other sections of the book. And so this idea that ancient indigenous mounds, of different kinds, platform mounds, conical mounds, effigy mounds, researchers and antiquarians and amateur archaeologists who studied them and excavated them, came up with a variety of reasons, some of them phrenological, the analysis of skulls, to propagate this narrative that it was some non-Indian race that had built these great civilizations, achieved fantastic technologies and levels of culture, and then been overthrown. And it's a classic kind of, or perhaps degenerated. There's some who believe in sort of a racial degeneration narrative, others who believe in this succession narrative. And either way, it's, from our perspective today, just sort of transparently justifying genocide against Native peoples on the grounds of this sort of teleological progress of civilizations.
Who is Henry Schoolcraft, and what role does he play in this? Because this is a figure that I didn't know about, and he seems like he seems like a really good find for you in terms of finding a single individual that sort of carries a lot of what you're talking about. He's a geologist, right? But more than that.
Yeah, he is both very peculiar and interesting. and also representative of the attitudes typical in this period among people like him, who were these kind of low-level functionaries, dabbled in archaeology and anthropology. And in Schoolcraft's case, what's unique is that he was stationed as an Indian agent in the Michigan Territory and actually did live, he married an Ojibwe woman, Jane Johnson Schoolcraft, and was in very close contact with Ojibwe culture. And so his early publications are these collections of stories that that his wife Jane helped to collect and translate. Her family all contributed material. And that sort of makes his reputation as what was then called an ethnologist, kind of a precursor of ethnography and anthropology.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's sort of his second career after he had previously failed as a geologist and mineralogist. And so, yeah, his life is kind of this like line that transects all of these interesting problems of anthropology and politics of that period. And so I was very interested in his early years in Sault Ste. Marie and his relationship with Jane Johnson Schoolcraft and her poetry. But then sort of after he loses his post as Indian agent due to mishandling of money, his next step is to become very interested in the history of mounds and these alternate histories of mounds. And he sort of fixates on the Grave Creek stone, which is an inscribed stone that was supposedly found during the excavation of the Grave Creek Mound in West Virginia, and wasn't widely noticed at the time of its discovery. And so he kind of picks it out of obscurity as like the thing that he's going to use to maybe sort of come back from this career setback. Mm. And so he translates it, he circulates his translations, he changes his position a few times on whether it is of Indian origin or of white origin. And ultimately, like, the most successful narrative that he put out there was that it was, some kind of wandering European tribe that had inscribed the stone and left it in the mound. And even though he wasn't 100% committed to that, and I think he knew that he was just like winging it, it still provided fodder again for this lineage of speculations about lost white races. And so even though he ultimately went back on that, he never fully endorsed the like alternate mound builder theories, it still in this sort of insidious way contributed to the discourse that's still with us about searching for lost giants and stuff like that.
Yeah, and like I'm like, what I know we can't do like a huge sort of like national psychological examination of like why this is, but it seems an important thing that people have a kind of investment in believing that sort of thing, and what purpose is it serving? I think that's the question I'm asking. Sort of like, what purpose does it serve to overturn the idea that these were indigenous people that made these mounds, which seems pretty obvious, and be like, no, it was actually this like ancient white race that maybe was wandering into it. What, in other words, why? I mean, part of me is thinking because I hadn't anticipated connecting it to ancient aliens, but I'm sitting here thinking like, why are people so invested in like overturning and telling you the real story? Because it seems like a really strong impulse in our current social media culture is to tell you that everything you know is bullshit, and in fact there was this real story underneath. But the real story they're often telling, like, it's like seems like it's serving some sort of ideological purpose, and it seems like Schoolcraft is in the 19th century.
Yeah, and that's something that I think a lot about. And in my first book, I'm very sympathetic to people who are searching for something, for some deeper truth, for some deeper reality. And yeah, I can certainly empathize with that. The sense that there is something beneath our world, like there is something hidden that we can only glimpse or access in these fleeting ways. And so I appreciate that spiritual outlook. And so in this book, I'm kind of exploring the dark aspects of that, or the ways in which that desire can be employed to fill these political purposes, and whether explicitly or kind of unconsciously capture those very like colonial desires. And even in the previous book, how they captured desires related to, gender and sexuality, and domination, and the sort of maintenance of rigid social norms. And so you see that unfolding in the production of these myths. And it sort of gets into the realm of psychoanalyzing the national mind, as you say, but there's a desire, and a desire for identity and belonging, a sense of history and place and connection to place, that is embedded in these stories and expressed in these fantasies, and in the insistence that they're not fantasies, but they're the real secret history. And it is really part of our media environment today. Like, how many 100 podcasts are there about secret histories, hidden histories? We all want to know the forbidden thing, but I think we have to look at how power is structured. And this is the thing about so many conspiracy theories. It's like,
I'm glad you said that word. That was the word that was coming to my head. Is like, this does sound like conspiracy theory in some way. And how much do you use that sort of that frame, thinking that through in this book? Because it seems like what you're locating in these early eras of American industrialization is an intersection with conspiracy theories, and how they're going to actually be useful in kind of mapping a lot of justification for a lot of the sort of exploitation, resource exploitation, but also genocide, and like the sort of running over of an entire previous civilization that was here requires some sort of story. And we always have like, well, it's the Manifest Destiny story and that's it. But it seems like it was like multiple stories, and you've got like a few layers of them. I'm just thinking like just this weekend, I think I posted it somewhere on social media, a U-Haul truck with a white family painted on the back in like a covered wagon crossing the prairie, and it said, "Do it yourself moving, an American tradition, since the 1700s or something." And it was just kind of like, do it yourself moving. And I thought about you because I knew I was going to talk to you this week. I thought, oh, there's a story, right? Like, it's a do-it-yourself move. That's what's happening here. Where that image of the like white family in the covered wagon seems like it accomplishes so much in terms of kind of telling you what this was about and then erasing what it was really all about.
Wow. Wow. There's a lot going on there. Wow. Because I'm just thinking about that, and I'm like, yeah, how different is that from the way that we move now, the way that people move through space now? You are just like getting your property and going to set up your little nuclear family and fortify the boundaries.
Totally, yeah.
It's freaky. Yeah. Ooh. I thought those U-Haul trucks were just like cool, dinosaur skeletons and stuff. Reconsidering.
They have some ideology to them for sure. Here I'm in the West, and so like so many of the U-Haul trucks are about like Utah and New Mexico and Arizona, and they can't help. They literally can't help using certain kind of Western iconography that looks like, it's like Monument Valley with some cowboys crossing through it. There's a million different like entryways into these stories. But let's talk about some of the other stories in your book, because the Schoolcraft and the mounds thing is crazy. I mean, I just spoke with a poet named Carrie Connors, who's from Moundsville, West Virginia, on this show, and she talked about as a kid. These are all like white kids who are the children of steelworkers and coal miners going to public school in Moundsville, West Virginia. Every year they took a field trip to the mounds where they walked on it, and then they were supposed to write poetry about it. And she brought it up because she said, the first poem I ever wrote was about the mound because they made us write a poem about it in school. And the school, she said all the school's kids just wrote a poem about the mound that was like, the mound goes round and round, and, sort of a cute little child's poem. But she was always a kid who had a different idea of things and wrote about like, what is this culture? Who is erased here? What is this? And it's sort of like consideration of the longer history of it. But it seems like to me that was really amazing because it links so clearly with what you're talking about, these mounds having a particular kind of charge for people, but it's like white people telling stories about them again and again.
Wow, I would love to talk to her about her childhood poetry and present day poetry. Yeah, that's interesting. You don't meet a lot of people from Moundsville. Yeah, I think that's and so in like looking at the history of that town, I definitely found many residents speculating along those lines. And again, feeling this sense of curiosity and desire to connect, that assigning kids to write poetry about it is like just inviting that, like seeing this thing as a blank canvas. And so that is not surprising. Certainly the prisoners across the street in the state penitentiary are doing that. They're sort of seeing it as a canvas for their imaginations.
She talked about living across from the penitentiary too, and I'm like, God, what a site, like in terms of its just the physical structures. And I love the idea. I mean, just the title of your book, "In Whose Ruins," is sort of like, well, whose like we know we're living on the sort of shell of a civilization that was here before European colonization, and yet at the same time, it seems like most people have a very kind of blank set of ideas about that. It's not a very specific set of stories. It's just like, well, the Indians were here before, and now we live in it. But there are, like you say, I mean, Moundsville is a really good example. The ruins are there. I mean, the ruins are physically there. And it seems like at some point you have to kind of tell a story about why they're there.
Yeah, and that's also the question of the title, because I think that the prison is the ruin of something. The prison is the ruin of these imperial ambitions and ambitions of white supremacy in certain ways. So obviously it's like it's both alive and falling into ruin and perpetually renewing itself, fueled by fear.
It just makes me think of like archaeologists finding this prison, the ruins of this prison in Moundsville, West Virginia in 1,000 years, and what stories they'll tell about the ruins of that prison, and what they'll make up and why. I mean, to me, like what your book sort of does for me is makes me realize how much, I mean, we're historians, so I guess we know this, but the idea that the story's never settled and that people are going to come along. To me, that's sort of what's terrifying about living in the age we're living in now, in which I realize now, like talking about all these podcasts, you can say whatever you want. You could tell whatever story you want. It's actually incredibly pliable. And that part of it in your book that you say, American culture continues to produce new stories that justify the violence of the past and fantasize its recurrence in an apocalyptic future. And there's something about the beliefs never mutating that to me is freaky, because it feels like we're living in an era right now in which the stories are mutating really rapidly, and things are you can sort of see in real time how people are, I don't know, weaponizing stories for their ideological purpose.
Yeah, and it's been that way. Yeah, I'm looking at a period when it's also very apparent the purpose that those stories serve. And part of the resonance of the book is that anxiety of ruin that is very present with us today and connected to climate change and various other things. And there's in a way, reading these 19th century meditations on the transit of empires and these settlers gazing at the mounds and wondering what their legacy will be for some distant future. There's a certain vanity and hubris to those musings, along with fear and, I think, potentially productive self-awareness. But it's not often turned to a sort of self-criticism. Well, it's not ever turned to a self-criticism.
Never. I love that phrase, potentially productive self-awareness. Well, tell me about oil, because I feel like oil, is it Petrolia? Is that the name of the place that you're describing? It's in Pennsylvania?
Yeah, this sort of unofficial name for this oil region of Western Pennsylvania and like southwestern New York, centered around like Oil City. And that my interest in that is more directly connected to my research on the history of spiritualism and psychical research. I became aware of spiritualists who are using their mediumistic talents to locate oil. And that clearly connected to, had this very clear connection to the salvationary properties of this liquid spontaneously bubbling out of the ground to fuel American power as they construed it. And so again, it's this desire to uncover the secrets within the earth, to feel a sense of divine sanction that God is providing at the appropriate time, everything that Americans would need to secure their dominance. And spiritualists seize that opportunity. And they, in their toolkit, they have the ability to literally testify, speak the words of the dead, and to demonstrate the reality of these religious beliefs through economic gain.
When is this happening? Because I always have I ended up being a 20th century American historian, but if you go through a PhD program, you got to do it all. And I remember in my orals at some point I had a little bit about industrialization and how industrialization in America really takes off after anthracite coal mines or coal fields are found underneath Pennsylvania, and I always had it in my head that Pennsylvania and underneath Pennsylvania, is the place that becomes a significant engine of industrialization because of the physical resource that's found there, and then the extraction of it. And this is another personal connection, is that my mom's side of the family comes from coal mining people in Pennsylvania, and so those stories and that sort of haunting of our family in some way, because they all moved out to California, and then that experience is somewhere like located in the past of the family in some way. But it seems like that like sort of it feels like an original sin place for American industrialization in some way, because it is like such a vast resource. But there's, to me, I'd never heard about the spiritual end of this. The idea that there would be a kind of, can you tell me a little bit more about like who these people are and when they're doing this? Is this the 18th century or the 19th century?
This is the mid-19th century. And so in terms of Pennsylvania as the origin point of a lot of energy infrastructure and extraction infrastructure, Christopher Jones has this great book, Roots of Power, and that was really helpful for me. And so he connects coal, oil, and hydropower. And the oil and hydropower elements were most important for me in my book. If I were a real environmental historian or a real energy historian, coal would obviously be the prime mover of a lot of these processes. And I was interested in oil because I think in its differences from coal, it was a lot more palatable in terms of how it could be used in more spiritualized narratives of economic growth and the divine bounty of natural resources, because coal was understood to involve this sort of brutal labor that nobody wanted to do, and except immigrants. Whereas oil was much more middle class in the sense that you had to have a little startup money to purchase the machinery and lease land. And it has it has that businessman's kind of allure that you could become independently wealthy and be your own boss, be your own boss. It's like pretty familiar today. And
yeah, I'm thinking of like There Will Be Blood, the movie with Daniel Plainview. It seems like a character. I know it's a fictional character, but it seems like a character that captures a little bit of what you're talking about. The kind of like the independent entrepreneurial businessman, but there's also like something in that character that's like trying to I don't know. There's a kind of force of almost supernatural force in the way that he is pursuing oil and feeling like he's the one that's going to be the master of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Upton Sinclair, his book "Oil!" Right. that movie is based on, is the master of writing about greed, that kind of possession by the resource or possession by money that becomes a driving power. And so this is also, the timeline of oil is convenient in that it coincides with the rise of spiritualism and other heterodox religious faiths in the same region. And so in the 1850s, that's all kind of bubbling over.
Literally. What do they actually believe, though? What do these spiritualists believe about oil?
They, again, describe it as part of God's plan. It has been, and I think not just spiritualists, but mainstream Christians generally use this language, that this is evidence of God's plans for American empire. It was placed there, awaiting the day when it would be discovered. And the first successful commercial oil well was drilled not by a spiritualist, and so its discovery is narrated as guided by God, guided by kind of divine or angelic forces that led him to this particular spot and to persist in his efforts. And so it's only after the oil boom starts around Titusville, Pennsylvania, that spiritualists get involved, and they're in geographical proximity. Their lecture circuit takes them through that part of Western New York and Pennsylvania. And so like everyone else at that time, they go to visit the oil fields because it's this new, exciting place. It's, maybe Silicon Valley today or in the early 2000s is like the analogy.
Wow.
You got to go there. You got to meet people. You got to maybe like get some leases. And so spiritualists are in very close contact with that and are quickly pulled into the oil mania. And there are already a set of practices, like more sort of folk practices around locating hidden things, dowsing for water, for instance. Those practices are adopted by oil speculators, and then spiritualists kind of seamlessly move in with their own techniques of channeling that don't look that different. So Abraham James, the first sort of official spiritualist oil speculator to get up a corporation and raise money from spiritualist investors in the mid 1860s, he discovers his oil well by entering a trance and like running around a field, and the spirits guide him to the place where he should drill. And so it's not that different from other sort of spiritualist seances or practices.
That's insane. I mean, I don't think a lot of people realize how interwoven that process is. Like the process, because I think industrialization is often associated with a sort of like rational, a movement of things away from the superstitions of the previous era and into a sort of rational way of dividing the world up. But it's incredible to think of how deeply entwined this sort of spiritual notion and religious notion. I guess the religious thing makes a lot of sense to us. We're used to that. But how deeply tied to the resources to the religious and spiritual stories is something that I think a lot of people haven't really investigated as deeply as you have here.
Yeah, and that sort of the weirdness of early oil is a lot of that is from Darren Dochuk's book Anointed with Oil, which has a more comprehensive like timeline of this whole, from wildcat speculators to like Gulf oil. And so he sort of connects it with the history of mining and these other sort of visionary ways of locating what's beneath the earth. And even for like liberal Christians, this connection of religion and science was very intuitive, that progress equals, a divinely created world and its divinely created laws being harnessed for economic purposes.
Right. I mean, it seems like it's a powerful way, actually, of creating a justification for something that otherwise would be difficult to justify in some ways, if that makes sense. Because part of the early years, industrialization, the early years, those were rough years, and not when I say that, I mean it's just massive exploitation and death of a working class that's more and more being drafted into this kind of work, and that doesn't even get into the erasure of what's happening to the land, what's happening to the people that were living on that land. I mean, it's a nightmare. You do need a justification for it. It seems like otherwise, I feel like there is a nightmarish religious story that can be told on the other side of it, if that makes sense.
There is, and
right.
It's hellish, and that's sort of Sinclair's oil is illuminating the hellscape that this industry creates, and that it certainly did in Western Pennsylvania. And part of the appeal is, part of its usefulness is the isolation of that region, and that it wasn't affecting, I think our image of industrialization is factory workers in cities, or perhaps coal miners, and those are both like less positive and appealing than this idea of like in some remote forest there is a literal fountain of wealth that is gushing that you can go and tap into.
And people aren't being exploited. It's just kind of, yeah. I live in Southern California, and the landscape here is dotted with oil machines and huge oil rigs out in the ocean that are sort of like, when you look out in the Pacific Ocean, it's just oil machines out there. You don't see, we see islands, beautiful islands, but also these gigantic oil rigs out there, and it's just part of the landscape. And it's something that you do have to tell a story about. I mean, we're going through a massive sort of local fight right now about oil. There's a set of propositions on the California ballot called A and B, and they're about they're about the ability of oil companies to do certain things. I won't go into a whole lot of detail about it, but the point is, the yes on A and B signs are very small compared to the no on A and B signs, which are being funded by the oil companies. And the only reason I bring it up is because so many people on like local Facebook boards that I see people discussing these issues, so many people have internalized the idea that oil is our local wealth, and what do you think oil is? And they have like a story to tell about oil being necessary to the kind of lifestyle we live, the progress there is, and they're like kind of like just mouthing these stories. And it's kind of incredible to me to see so many people who are just ordinary people who don't really have any money they're making from oil at all, sort of like really, really invested in defending it, and defending it as kind of connected to a way of life. And that to me, like, that connects so deeply with the story you're telling here, which is that you got to convince people that oil is blood, oil is magic, oil is something that we really desperately need to run our world. And God, the origins of that story are so freaky to me.
Yeah, very successful. And it's not just media and advertising, it is really building up what reads as grassroots support in communities, these investments of, Pew, for instance, in sending his employees out into the community to like educate children about how great oil is. You show up at the Rotary Club meetings, in small towns, you like reach you communicate with your neighbors, and spread these talking points. It's funny, I'm reading Sinclair Lewis's Main Street, and I just hadn't read it before. And there's just this passing comment about how the Chautauqua comes through town in this like small Midwestern town, and they're preaching about the importance of workers not unionizing and oil and all of that stuff. And so like really deep penetration into communities as this sort of common sense all-American stance on how things should be.
God, I'm sitting here. I've seen There Will Be Blood too many times, but like this movie, I got to watch it again now in the light of your work, because it seems like it resonates so deeply. I mean, the town of, like, I think it's Little Boston in the movie is like, there's a point in the movie where Daniel Plainview, this oil man, says like, we're gonna be bringing a lot of industry here, which means we're going to be building roads and we're going to be building schools. And I think it's a shame that you haven't been able to build bread here. So we're going to fix that, and we're going to get fun. There's, in other words, like this whole sort of promise of a civilization that oil is going to deliver.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And in my mind, there's always a sort of contrarian, and I'm going to go give a talk on this book at the Drake Well Museum. So that person may show up and be like, oil is the foundational engine of the 20th century. And to that, I'm like, that is true in a certain sense. And we can't undo that.
Right.
But I think understanding the effects that it had in the past and is having now is an important step to like figuring out something else, like that this is not a natural and inevitable or desirable state of things. And at the time in the 19th century, in the 1860s, obviously they didn't understand what climate change was. That was not something that anyone was imagining. And so for them, the downsides of oil were more isolated to the areas where it was being extracted. But also gradually, extending to cars, which obviously killed a lot of people. And that was something that had to be normalized. And the ability to work around the clock and all of these other things that people did not necessarily like and were normalized and had to be carefully incentivized with these other kinds of promises of convenience and abundance.
I love that. I mean, I don't love that because it's scary, but the idea that every bit of the things that we think of as the bedrock elements of American culture, like cars, are things that you had to be sort of adjusted to. I mean, I think about it a lot, and this is sort of a stoner dorm room thought, but there's a very looking out at a tangle of freeways in Los Angeles and thinking, how the hell did this happen? How did it become normal that like roads are the sort of like roads have become the sort of dominant visual feature of the American landscape just for cars, and then we oriented our whole lives around that. And I know that's a long story, but to me, it's one that is pretty key to understand, because it is like, how does a whole nation normalize something that they don't want, or that they don't isn't natural, or isn't something that they're that they are sort of longing for? I mean, it brings up consent issues for me. I think about this a lot. You don't consent to the era you're born into, but like, I, I never wanted to have a phone in my hand and be flipping through. You know what I mean? Like I didn't get, and it feels like you're just sort of like brought into the technology of the era. But because we're living in a moment where digital technology is so deeply embedded in every aspect of our lives, it feels like, what story do we tell to justify all of this? What, like, at what point are we thinking like, why are we doing all of this? And it feels like, I don't know. You can people if there's someone like you, Alicia, who's going to tell a story in 1,000 years, they might be telling about Silicon Valley, maybe 100 years, in the same way that you're talking about places like Pennsylvania or West Virginia, places where capitalism kind of moved some way and kind of created a story around it.
Yeah, and I think one aspect of it is that those critiques are being made as it's happening.
Yeah.
And the way that they get steamrolled over by a sort of more optimistic and materialistic aspirational set of narratives is something that's interesting to attend to. Again, what does it buy us? I don't know. But it's important, I think, in the sense that we're never discovering something for the first time. And at least, I don't know, for me, there is some sense of solidarity in the fact that people in the past didn't find this to be an inevitable course of events and had very clear, opinions and critiques about it. And so it's not without precedent to question those things.
Right. Like there's always a contest. I mean, there's a contest now, I guess, about technology and sort of Elon Musk and electric cars and all that kind of stuff is embedded in a larger sort of set of stories that are connected to these ideologies. Can we talk a little bit about Los Alamos? Because I hate I know I keep bringing up pop culture, but I was thinking about when I was reading about your section on nuclear energy and nuclear bombs and in New Mexico, I was thinking about Twin Peaks and the new Twin Peaks and sort of he locates it kind of resonates deeply with your work in some ways, because what Lynch locates in Twin Peaks is sort of this original sin of nuclear energy and atomic bombs, and that reaching into very, very creepy kind of elements of American culture and politics and the direction of history in the years after that we're still trapped in. So what is your Los Alamos section of your book about?
Yeah, I hadn't seen the new Twin Peaks when I was
Sorry,
it, obviously, but yeah, that inflection point between these narratives that are expansionist and optimistic about the future and the emergence, the undeniable presence of this death drive, of this thing that is depicted as necessary, essential for America's survival, but also so obviously a catastrophic endgame if it were to ever be used. And even when it's not used, something that is death dealing simply by existing and by being continually produced and disposed of. And so, yeah, so I felt like looking at nuclear weapons and nuclear power was this resource that pivots from the past to the future because of these long-term consequences of nuclear radiation and waste disposal. And yeah, I mean, it was something that I was not as knowledgeable about. I do more 19th century stuff. And so I had to read up, not a historian of nuclear physics by any means. But the way that those narratives circulated at the time clearly connected for me to the previous set of anecdotes.
How do they connect? Are there spiritualists around the atomic bombs, or what is? I mean, to me, like there's There's so many like I know Christopher Nolan is making a movie about the beginnings of the atomic bomb right now, the Oppenheimer and all that kind of stuff. But it's like there's such existentialism that comes from it. It seems like it's hard not to. Even the scientists who were involved in it are saying things like, "Now I've become death, destroyer of worlds, etc." What is the spiritual element? What is the story element of the nuclear development section of your book?
Yeah, so it's interesting that this is like being revived as a theme of pop culture interest. And for me, it was very explicitly connected in terms of the affects around it, very related to climate change today. And in terms of the successes and failures of anti-nuclear movements. I couldn't read about that without thinking about the climate movement and its widespread kind of like awareness and support, but lack of actionable results. And so looking back to, and part of, I think what I'm doing, I'm not specifically, again, a historian of physics. And so I was looking at the setting and the history of colonization of the Southwest long before the Manhattan Project, and the way that colonization was spiritualized. And there was this idea, even before there was a material resource to be extracted, the idea that the place itself had spiritual power and properties that were vaguely associated with indigenous traditions and peoples, that was available for white tourists, for this kind of early 20th century bohemian scene of artists and writers who were seeking renewed vitality, taking the rest cure, trying to what in some cases is like a genuine interest in indigenous cultures, but also is mingled with an acquisitive tendency, literally buying and trading pottery and textiles, and really transforming the economy for indigenous people.
Very familiar as someone who is born and raised in Southern California, and I don't know if these things exist in other malls in America, but there's a store called Native Visions here that's like in a lot of the malls. That's just like it's just sort of a lot of tchotchkes and a lot of stuff like that, and people love their little bits of Native American culture kind of pinned to their clothes or hanging from their rear view mirror as a dream catcher. It's ubiquitous still, and it seems like a very easy way to just kind of be a little bit spiritual, or even as a political thing, a nod to like, well, I know something of the history of this place. It's a weird phenomenon for sure.
It's very weird, and that's kind of, as far as I know, that early 20th century period is like the origin of those tchotchke stores, in that like there's this craze, and this coincides with the quote unquote closing of the frontier and the obviously brutal US conquest and victories in the Indian Wars. And so Philip Deloria writes about that period as a time when the Indian threat, has been successfully quashed. And at that point, it becomes very consumable. And so that's when, railroads are starting to run out to Santa Fe, and that trade in tourist goods really picks up and is popular, on the East Coast in trendy parlors and stuff.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's we mentioned it at some point. We were talking about the Doors and Jim Morrison and his sort of like Native American vision thing, and we were trying to figure out ways to see that as something different than just pure, cultural appropriation, because in part it feels like Jim Morrison and the Doors were trying to like intervene on the story in some way, and they were like, they were trying to be with the kids and like say something about American history. It's all really complicated because it feels like that story is just filled with iconography that people can kind of grab and I guess I feel like it's always going to be there in some way. I think we can expect it to mutate. I love your idea of mutation and kind of how these stories change over time. And I'm wondering, I'm intrigued to hear what you really mean by the idea of like writing this book during the Trump administration and it changing for you after. What do you mean by that? Because it seems like I get it. Like I get like the impulse in part. It seems like, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like your book is sort of an intervention on the idea of conspiracy theory and the idea of stories as connected to particular ideologies.
Yeah, I think that the first thing I wanted to touch on, let's see if I can remember. Oh yeah, the first thing that I wanted to say was that the fourth section about nuclear power was also important in that it includes the story of resistance to that power.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where I saw like important resonances for the present. And actually, I did listen to your interview with Henry Marr about his book on the anti-nuclear movement, which is really cool and wasn't out when I was writing this. Otherwise, I would have cited it. But like I was also really intrigued to like rediscover this period this history that I didn't know much about because it was kind of marginalized in left spaces by the time I was around.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It was seen as kind of like boring and passé to be worried about nukes.
It was everyone's parents, you know? I feel like there's a generation of leftists now who are like in their 20s, 30s, and even 40s whose parents are not, like, they're like, you know, it's a new version of a red diaper baby, I guess. But I talked to a lot of younger leftists on this show, and so many of them are like, well, my parents were really active in the anti-nuclear movement in the 70s and 80s. But I mean, that history all goes all the way back, as you know, right? It's further back than that.
Yeah, and it felt important to connect that up in that, again, we're not reinventing these things.
Mm-hmm.
And what's interesting about it was that it was so mainstream and yet also suffered the fate of these of sort of social movements that achieve a mainstream appeal and then, you know, get a mainstream solution, which is, you know, an arms control agreement, you know, testing restrictions, and the kind of broad sense that the problem has been solved, which then allows the thing to continue in the quiet of its nuclear silos without ever really the structural issues being addressed. And that was the critique of you know, factions of the anti-nuclear movement that were explicitly anti-racist and anti-imperialist, but those things had not been addressed. You know, defense funding had not been diverted to social needs, and everyone kind of, well, many people, the mainstream, you know, segments of the movement packed it in at that point.
Right. And I mean, nuclear bombs, as we know, are just one horrific element of, you know, a massive military industrial complex that can do a lot of destruction without nuclear bombs. I mean, and has been doing a lot of destruction for decades without nuclear bombs. You're right. That Henry Marr episode was really challenging for me. I loved talking to him because it was I don't know if it did this for you, but for me, I had never really thought or known, actually, that sort of like how anti-nuclear sentiment became a kind of pop cultural thing and was so popular during this moment. And it was the rare nostalgia trap interview where there was a little hope when it comes to like resistance and the ability of ordinary people to actually do anything to challenge the dominance of these huge, terrible institutions. But then, yeah, the other part of it, I guess you just reminded me, is that, well, you know, we still have nuclear bombs and the danger still seems there. I mean, with Russia and Ukraine and everything's going on in Europe, I feel like people are talking about it more now, but it just seems like a cycle again. Okay, we'll get another popular movement together. I don't know. Your book really does a lot for me in terms of connecting how important storytelling and mythology and almost like, I don't know, like a religious or spiritual element to it seems like a really powerful engine for this sort of thing. And the left rarely has that. I feel like the right and capitalists have a lock on telling stories that matter to people, and that's really scary.
Yeah, they definitely have a lot on a lot of the sort of religious and spiritual sensibility. And, to the extent that people on the left engage with that, I also like encourage careful scrutiny of the sort of conscious reflection on like how to do that. And, thinking about the role that long history of kind of individualism in American versions of spirituality and esoteric religions and the occult, which I think is the kind of side of spirituality that is more attractive to people on the left.
Mm-hmm.
And I think is very powerful and important. But it's just critical to like be aware of that long history of kind of individualist self-help embedded in like manifesting and yeah, it's interesting because a lot of those like anarchists in the early 20th century who are circulating through the Southwest, they're interested in what indigenous people are doing in, spiritually speaking, and what that has to offer to for their own interest in the occult. And it's all very interesting, but definitely like sobering to read their words and the stories that they came up with at that time. Because they're like not things that we would smile upon today.
What do you mean we wouldn't smile upon them? It reads as just kind of like appropriation and that kind of thing?
Yeah, it reads as kind of pretty dumb appropriation, not a lot of depth of understanding.
Sounds like a lot of hippie stuff I read in the 60s, which was sort of like that too. It was sort of like there was the faith of the like born again person that's like discovering it later in life, and like, did you know that Indians use astral projection and you can do it too? And you're kind of like, wait a second, this seems a little simplistic, and it seems very natural too in some ways that like there are people. I mean, I don't think it's just white people. Like, it's the white people is just maybe a kind of way of getting into that. Americans. Many Americans just feel like they are looking for something else, and Native Americans seem like a good place to locate that something else, if that makes sense. And there's so much projection upon that group of people who are such, like, as we know, millions of diverse different tribes, and there's no one tradition. But it feels like, I don't know, Native Americans still serve a purpose, if that makes sense, for people that are looking for something deeper in American life. It's really... there are a lot of dangers to that, I guess.
Absolutely. And in the way that those spiritual longings become ideological, and I think like those are the two sides of it, what you just said. Like there's the side of it that is about appropriating and consuming the past and the indigenous past into these American stories, as with the myth of the mound builders. And then there's this side of it that comes at the end of my book, which is sort of seeking an escape. Sort of seeking to become something other than this American thing, because that there's guilt, that that there's blood on your hands, and so you see a lot of Los Alamos scientists not doing so with any amount of personal reflection, but very eagerly engaging with indigenous crafts and history. And it's hard not to read that as a kind of escapism and an attempt to get out of your positionality and inhabit a different one.
Oh yeah, I mean, I was definitely like this when I was young, and I was like raised in kind of like Reagan conservatism. And when I first discovered Howard Zinn and the story of Native American, I latched onto it, really powerfully, in part because like there's a way of being that there's another story to America, and that's sort of, there's a lot of like, I don't know, utopianism that's sort of projected onto native history, and the idea of like they had it right. I mean, this sort of anarcho-primitivist impulse goes that way. So like the Native Americans had it all figured out. They knew how to do agriculture. They knew how to do everything, and then industrialization came and just wiped it out. And I feel like that's a very easy story for people to tell. It's kind of true, but it's also kind of gets away from, I don't know, our own complicity in it still. For me, it all, I don't know if you would agree with this, but it feels like a paralyzing story in part because it's like, well, it's already done and there's nothing you can do about it. And now we can just use it to like score points over each other.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Right.
And so I think that's like it's like, I'm a big fan of like Nick Estes' work and like the Red Nation.
Yeah,
and
for sure.
It's like they're telling that story and doing that work, and it's awesome. And I feel like it's important for us to be, looking critically at the uses of history in sort of mainstream American culture.
Well, when all the when the oil fight was happening at Standing Rock, right? I mean, it was just kind of like, how can you think that this story is over? You know, like here are Native people lined up against oil companies and the U.S. government who are shooting tear gas at them, etc. It's hard not to see this as a continuing story and not something that's like long ago settled in the past.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that has been part of that, has been continually active. And so I was also like, it's funny because like I remember when Winona LaDuke ran for vice president on the Nader ticket, and at the time, like I just didn't understand what that meant and the movement that she was a part of.
Mm-hmm.
And so like reading her articles from the 70s, protesting nuclear development in the Southwest was like really connecting the dots in terms of like, this has been happening, for a long time. And there is an important influence and shaping power of Indigenous leaders on the environmentalism of the mid 20th century.
Yeah.
And so like we need to understand that and not these kind of mythological images of
I'm thinking about the crying Indian you mentioned the 70s. I mean, it's like that idea is so insane to me. I don't know if people have seen this commercial from the 70s where, a Native American actor is sort of like crying as he sees someone throw a piece of litter on the ground. And it's sort of like, God, how we employ these images and stories is so fucked up. And part of like a lot of guilt. It feels like that entire commercial was about like feel guilt for the crying Indian you have offended by throwing trash on the ground. And it's like, I don't know if I'm kind of accepting the parameters of this story here, because it seems like one that again sort of places, I don't know, it repeats a lot of the prejudices that you're describing.
Absolutely. And that was like an Italian guy, right?
Yeah. There's a documentary that I watched that was about that. I'll put it in the episode notes when I think about it, because I can't remember the name right now. But that one last point that maybe you and I could probably do another conversation about if you're willing to come back, because the idea of like the occult and the left, and that notion of kind of like the individual pursuit of occult practices and the New Age, I think that's a really critical idea, because we've had a few conversations about the occult on this program over the years, and I think that, I don't know, I haven't really settled in my mind how exactly you meld occult practices and the power of spirituality, the power of religion, to something that's not individual but collective and like a left project. That's something that is a mystery to me, but I'd love to talk more about. Your book makes me think a lot about it, because it does feel like that power has a lot to do with your ability to tell stories that resonate. So I just want to say the name of your book, Alicia, before we go. Your newest book is called In Whose Ruins? Power, Possession, and the Landscapes of American Empire. Really great stuff. Thanks so much for coming on again.
Thank you so much. Yeah, this was a great talk.
Well, okay, I think that's going to do it for Nostalgia Trap today. I want to thank my guest, Alicia Puglionesi. Go check out this book, In Whose Ruins? Power, Possession, and the Landscapes of American Empire. I cannot tell you how fascinating her takes on American history are. So go check out that stuff. Thank you, Alicia, for coming on the show and having a conversation with me. If you enjoy Nostalgia Trap stuff, you can find lots more on our Patreon page, including Campus Trap with Ryan Boyd and Gender Trap with Yasmin Nair. Much more to come this summer. Patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. We appreciate it, and we will talk to you soon. Take care. Bye-bye.